Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible class on the life of David. Today we are in Lesson 9, David at Ziklag. We're looking in 1 Samuel chapter 28 through 31, and we are completing the book of 1 Samuel, and we are completing the story of King Saul. His journey will end with us here in the end of 1 Samuel. We ended last class in chapter 27 with David and all of his men moving to Ziklag in the land of the Philistines. David was very low and discouraged and felt like there was no alternative. His only choice was to go and to live in the land of the enemy. And so they go and they stay here for about a period of a year and 4 months. If you look at chapter 27 and verse 7. While they're here, they seek to win over the favor of the Philistines, and by raiding the enemies of Israel and giving the appearance that they've turned against their own people. You look at chapter 27, verses 10 through 12, and the first two verses of chapter 28. Well, here in chapter 28, the Philistines have gathered their camps, gathered their armies for war against Israel, and they've camped out in Shunem. Saul had been in war against the Philistines all throughout his reign. You look at chapter 14 and verse 52, which just describes that clearly, that Saul's reign has been one of the key features of his reign is that he continually had battle against the Philistines. Well, here, the number of troops must have been extraordinary because Saul was terrified, and he realized that he was outmatched. We're looking in 1 Samuel 28 and verse 5. It says, when Saul saw the armies of the Philistines, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly. Well, what's he do? He's outmatched. He's outmanned. He's looking at the armies here, looking at the numbers. It doesn't seem like there's any way he's going to win. What does Saul do in a time like this? Well, typical Saul fashion, he seeks out help and advice through a medium. Look at verse 3. It says that Samuel had died and all of Israel had mourned for him, and they buried him in Ramah in his own city, and Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. So it's a key detail here. Saul had removed the mediums out of the land, and thus here, when he's in a great desperation, who does he choose to go to? The mediums, the ones he removed from the land. The reason he's seeking out a medium is in verse 6. God has stopped communicating with Saul. Saul would inquire from the Lord, and God would be silent. There's no dreams. There's no message from a prophet. There's no Urim among his people. There's no priest to communicate for him. Radio silence from heaven. And so Saul seeks the Lord's favor. God doesn't say a word. And so he's worried, verse 15. He's worried about the upcoming battle, and God isn't hearing his cries. God isn't hearing his prayers. So Saul has his men seek out a medium. Very mediums that he removed from the area, from the land. Now, there's an important detail about this. The word for medium, the Hebrew word is ha'obot, Haobot, and it means the spirit of divination, which is almost always rendered as ventriloquist. I was going to get that, ventriloquist. So these mediums use a variety of tricks to deceive those who came for their business, just as they do today, without a doubt. And certainly, as you see here, ventriloquism would have been one of their means of tricking the people. Look over at Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 29 and in verse 4. Isaiah 29 and verse 4. Here's what the text says. It says, you will be brought low from the earth, and from the dust your speech will be bowed down. Your voice shall come from the ground like the voice of a ghost, and from the dust your speech shall whisper. Well, one author puts it this way. I think he describes it well. It says, the whole thing was then as now a complete hoax. The necromancer using ventriloquism would make it appear that sounds were coming up out of a hole or a crack in the earth. They would also use their skills to provide the voice of the dead. So this view of the medium, that's how the word is defined. This view of the medium best fits what we're going to find here in the story. Because Saul comes disguised to this medium and asks for her to conjure up Samuel, verse 8 and verse 11. when she sees Samuel in verse 12, notice her response. Verse 12, it says, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. She screamed. I mean, it makes you wonder, what did she expect to see? What did she expect would happen? I mean, she's acting as if the appearance of Samuel is an absolute complete surprise. She's absolutely terrified. She's shocked. Complete surprise. It's as if she was prepared to do her little mumbo jumbo, her pretending, and to make up her own voice for Samuel, as if it's Samuel speaking from the ground. And she was completely surprised that she was actually successful in bringing up Samuel. Now, she was able to draw the conclusion here as to who Saul was, likely because of the relationship between Saul and Samuel, and likely because this is a miracle that has taken place. Because this wasn't by her power. It was God who sent Samuel back for one very last chilling prophetic message to Saul. The message is found in verse 16 through 19. Samuel says, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your son shall be with me. The Lord will give the armies of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Oof, what a message. The Lord is doing what he said he would do, and he's giving the kingdom to David. And the reason he's doing this is because Saul disobeyed. Saul chose to disobey. He points back to 1 Samuel 15 and the incident of the Amalekites. God told Saul, he commanded him to utterly destroy the Amalekites. He didn't. He didn't listen. He partially obeyed, which means it meant he disobeyed. And then in verse 19, ooh, that chilling message. Tomorrow you're going to be where I am, Saul. This is it. You're dying tomorrow. God is giving Israel into the hand of the Philistines, and Saul and his sons will lose their life this next day. And this just sucks the life and strength out of Saul. I think verse 20, this is not the message he had intended. This is not the way he saw this going down. And so he realizes that his end is near. There's a lesson for us here, maybe as we just kind of pause before going on in our text, is that through Saul's actions in this chapter, in the stead of God's silence, which should have said plenty, Saul sought for a voice, breaking God's commandments. You look at Leviticus 19 and verse 31, Leviticus 20 and verse 6, seeking out this sort of witchcraft, diviner, medium, all of which was commanded by God not to do for God's people. Well, here's a similar vein of thought today. It's not that people are going to these divinists today, but think about what Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 and 4, when he said that there will be some who won't endure sound doctrine, but instead they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires. You know, I think the question we ought to ask is, when I don't like what I've heard from the Bible, when I've read or been taught, in a place of silence, do I seek a different voice? Do I seek a replacement voice? Do I try and get someone else's interpretation, someone else's approval for the things that I'm looking for? And do I seek teachers or doctrines or books or blogs to fill my desires, to approve the things I'm trying to do? Because Saul had to hear for himself, in denial, right? He's in denial. He had to hear for himself, compared to David, who has heard rebuke and reproof, and he had a heart that was soft enough and teachable enough to accept it and to change. And that's a question for me. When I hear something that I don't like, maybe it's a message I've heard from a teacher or a preacher, or something that I have read in the message myself in the Bible. I'm just reading in my daily Bible reading, and I see something that bothers me. It's obvious it's in conflict with the way that I'm living. Do I try and seek a different voice, a replacement message, to try and make it seem like everything I'm doing is okay? Or do I accept what is found here as truth in the Word of God and change my life accordingly. Saul learned that the hard way. Well, we come back to David in chapter 29 of 1 Samuel, and he's still in Ziklag. And it's in this chapter that we see David and his men gathering with the Philistines to go to war against Israel. Even though we're not really given insight into David's mind, maybe a possible reason for David's desire to fight would be that he would do exactly what they feared. That he would get into battle, and once they started battling against Israel, he would turn against them. Maybe that's what David was thinking. Thus far, David has been engaged in military operations that he knew that Achish would not approve of, and he hid them from Achish, the king of the Philistines. And so David would have been anxious to fight in this battle, perhaps to help protect the Lord's anointed. But the lords of the Philistines protested. They have no trust in David due to his history, due to his past track record with the armies of the Philistines. And you see that verse 4 and verse 6 here, chapter 29. And so, despite all this, and despite the evidence stacked up against David of all that he's done with the Philistines, Achish still had a very favorable view of David. You look at verse 3 and 6 and 9. But because the lords of the Philistines insisted, even though David and his men want to join in the battle, they are not allowed. They are refused, and they're sent back to Ziklag. Well, when they get back to Ziklag, get back home, still in the land of the Philistines, when they get back to Ziklag, 3 days later, they come home to a disaster. The Amalekites have come in, and they've raided Ziklag. They've raided their territory. They have captured their women, their wives, their children. They have carried them off. And you notice at first who it is who captured their loved one. It's the Amalekites, the same nation who Saul was supposed to destroy. So at least notice this. I have this note here. At least notice the irony that the nation that comes in to capture David's loved ones is the very nation that God commanded Saul to utterly destroy back in chapter 15. So in other words, here David is indirectly still hurt by Saul because Saul did not obey the Lord. Well, David raided the Amalekites in chapter 27 and verse 8. So here they're returning the favor and they take David's loved ones. So the people come back discouraged. They find their homes in verse 3 burnt and destroyed. And the men in verse 4 mourn and they weep. Because you have to kind of imagine if you build it up. They've been on the run. They've been hiding from King Saul. Now they're not even in their own land, not even in their own country, not around their own kinsmen and their families. They just have their own nucleus family with them. Their own individual families with them. And now their families are taken. Their homes are destroyed. They're in the land of the enemy. Saul's still king. Everything's still going on. I mean, it seems about you're getting as low as you can get. And so it says in verse 6 that these men who have all this time stood up for David and been with David and defended David, well, now their families are personally affected. Their wives and their kids are captives. And so in verse 6, they talk about stoning David. Enough is enough. See, it was David's move. It was David's decision to move down to Ziklag. It was David's decision to go to the land of the enemy. And so now his men are turning against him. But, it's here in this low moment that we see that good heart of David. Because though he is discouraged and defeated, verse 6 tells us that David strengthened himself in the Lord. What do you think that means? What's it mean to strengthen yourself in the Lord? It means to draw strength from, to find encouragement in and from the Lord. See, even though David was alone, didn't have his family now, didn't have his friends who had now turned against him, and enemies who didn't want him, David was completely alone. He realized he ultimately wasn't alone. Even in the land of the enemy, even far from Israel, God was there. And so he turned to the Lord. Because who was there to help David? No one. Sometimes we find ourselves like that. We find ourselves low when it seems like those who we trust the most and love the most aren't there for us when we need them. But remember, God's always there. God is always there. Even far away in the land of the enemy. Even sunken deep in the pits of our own choices or just pits of bad things that have happened in life, God will be there. And he will help us climb out. He'll give us the strength. stand with us in our times that we feel alone. The Apostle Paul knew that in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. He says that all had deserted him, but the Lord stood with him. And that's what David realized too. So David does three things here. Number one is that he prays, finds out God's will, and trusts in that will. That's verse 8. He prays, finds out the will of the Lord, and decides to put his trust in God's will. Secondly, he turns the men on the right focus. He says, don't take it out on me. I am not the enemy here. I didn't take your kids. I didn't take your wives. Let's not forget who the real enemy is. And so he rallies them and directs that anger, directs that hurt where it belongs. Let's focus on the enemy and let's go get them back. So with 400 men, they slaughtered the enemies and received all that they had lost. Verses 17 to 20. Okay, so they say, okay, let's not fight each other. We're not the enemies here. Let's go fight the real enemy. So they gather up 400 men. They go and they fight the enemy. There's a good lesson there. Maybe just a side point. When you're angry, when you've been hurt by someone else, what are you going to do about it? Killing David's not going to get your family back. Taking out our problems on one another is not going to make things get better. Evil is not come by evil. And let's not forget who the real enemy is. Sometimes we get so busy fighting against one another that we forget Satan's behind it all. Satan's behind it all. And when we fight and bicker and complain and devour one another, we're just fighting his battles for him. Don't forget who the real enemy is. He can use us to turn us against each other, but just choose grace, choose patience, and let's rally. Let's rally. Let's use that hurt. Let's use that anger, and let's respond against the enemy. And we defeat Satan. We defeat the devil and his works, not with evil. That's his weaponry. No, we put on Christ. We put on the armor of God. We bear forth the fruit of the Spirit. And we prove ourselves to be loyal, obedient to Christ. We're crushing Satan with victory after victory, overcoming those temptations when we do so. So David rallied the men, and they went and pursued the enemy and claimed back their families. And then the third thing he does here is he keeps the men from turning on themselves. When you look down in verse 9, we are in chapter 30, down in verse 9. It says that David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind because they were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. So as they're going, 200 men are just too tired. They're too exhausted to go on. That's a third of the men. The 400 go on to conquer the Amalekites and capture all the spoil. When they return to those who were too tired by the brook, wicked men say, we're not going to share with you. You didn't fight with us. You didn't go into battle with us. And so since you didn't go into battle, since you stayed here saying you're too tired, we're not going to give you anything that we took. You don't get it. But David responds with grace. He demonstrates that compassionate heart of a shepherd, the real true heart of leadership. Because you see in verse 23 of chapter 30, David says, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given us into the hand, given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so is his share who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. So he says, just don't do this. Remember, the battle's not in us. It's not because we won or we're so strong. God is the real victor. All this really belongs to God. We're going to share with each other. There's some, even today, some who are tired, some who need rest, while others are strong and others are marching, able to march on ahead. What's our attitude towards those who are tired right now? What's our attitude towards those who need some rest, who need to lag behind? Well, David is not going to allow the victory to become a defeat, and neither should we. When you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and in verse 14, Paul says, we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, and be patient with all. There's going to come a time in life when you are strong when another is weak, when you're able to march on when someone needs to pause and to get some rest. But there's going to come a time when we need some rest and we're tired while others are pressing and marching on. Don't make your brethren your enemy. Be gracious. Be strong when they are weak. so that in the times that you are weak, others can be strong for you. So David sends the share, the spoil with those, he shares it with those in Judah. No, another way of communicating himself that he was not part of the enemy. And then we come to the last chapter, chapter 31. The last chapter of 1 Samuel records the death of Saul and his 3 sons in the Battle of Gilboa. He and his 3 sons are killed. One of those sons is Jonathan, David's closest friends. Saul is fatally hit by an arrow, and rather than refusing to let the Philistines kill him, he makes his armor bearer kill him. And after the armor bearer refuses to do so, Saul falls on his own sword. So verse 5, Saul dies right there, and his armor bearer does the very same thing. They take their own lives. The Israelites flee. The Philistines come and occupy their cities. In verse 7, the Philistines decapitate Saul. And they hang the bodies of he and his sons on the wall in just this very disgraceful, shameful way. Some valiant men come and take down the bodies and bury them just to kind of preserve the honor of Saul. And that's it. That's the end of 1 Samuel 31. It's the end of 1 Samuel. And it's the end of Saul's journey, the end of Saul's story. So when you get to this point, as we're studying along in this study of the life of David, you got to kind of pause and ask the question, what do we learn from Saul? We've spent some time over the past couple of lessons looking at King Saul. What do you learn from him? Well, I think one lesson that certainly stands out is that compromise comes with a great cost. Saul lived a life of compromise. He chose to offer the sacrifice rather than waiting for Samuel in 1 Samuel 13. He killed some of the Amalekites while refusing to kill all of them, keeping the best in chapter 15. A tragedy in Saul's life is that he never had to be that way. He never had to have died that way, to have drifted from the Lord. He chose that path. He chose it. He could have been a great king had he chosen a different path, had he made God-honoring decisions. But inch by inch, day by day, he compromised. He compromised in this life of disobedience, of self-will over God's will. He chose a life of his own way apart from God, and he received the fruit from that decision, the fruit that brought. I think something else you learn here is that he played the fool. It's a fool in Psalm 53 verse 1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And that's what Saul lived. He lived as if he was God. He obeyed the rules that he wanted to obey. He put to death people that he wanted to put to death just to satisfy his suspicion or his pride. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befall them both. That's Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 14. A wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know one fate befalls them both. Or maybe Proverbs 29 verse 11. A fool always loses his temper, but a wise man holds it back. Or Proverbs 26 and verse 11. Like a dog that returns to vomit, so is a fool who repeats his folly. Proverbs 18 and verse 2, a fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind. Proverbs 10 and verse 23, doing wickedness is a sport to a fool, and so is wisdom to a man of understanding. Proverbs 10 verse 8, the wise man will receive commands, but a babbling fool will be thrown down. Do you hear Saul in all those Proverbs? They're described as the fool, but Saul lived the fool. He lived his life as if there was no God, and he was God. And I think maybe one concluding point here is that first does not mean best. First does not mean the greatest. He was the first king, and he will be remembered as the first king, but he's also remembered for all of his wickedness. Ezekiel 18 verse 24 says, when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, commits iniquity, and does according to all the abominations that a wicked man does, will he live? All his righteous deeds which he has done will not be remembered, for his treachery which he has committed, and his sin which he has committed, for them he will die. First is not always the best. First is not always greatest. He looked like the kings of the other nations. He behaved like the kings of the other nations, and that is the point. The people of Israel asked God for a king just like the nations around them, and God gave them exactly what they asked for. I think what rightly did Samuel say about Saul, 1 Samuel 15 verse 28, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Even as a youth, even as a shepherd in the fields, David was better than Saul. And he was better not because he was stronger in the flesh, stronger physically. It's not because he was richer, because he wasn't. He was greater because he had a heart after God's. And that's the lesson there. We don't have to follow the example of Saul. Don't compromise. Don't live life as if there is no God. No, learn to listen, learn to be taught, learn from your mistakes, and don't keep going down that path. We'll find ourselves having more of a heart like David when we're able to learn from our bad choices, our bad decisions, to repent and to grow and to become more and more like Jesus because of them. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope you maybe learned something here and learned something new. If you've got something that you see from this text, I'd love to hear from you and see some things that you've learned. Thank you again. Come back and tune in with us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.